I hope everyone listening is getting a real glimpse at the leadership at the FDA and to see that it is populated with people who are transformative and are really big systems thinkers. These dedicated civil servants are national treasures. I think this was mentioned earlier. It is without these people really dedicating their lives to the kinds of changes and attention to regulatory science and innovation, we would really be lost, and none of the progress that's been made during this pandemic would have happened. And certainly our next speaker is no exception. This is Dr. Jeffrey Shuren. He is the director of the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, and he's been the director since 2018 and the acting director since 2009. He trained at Northwestern and at Tufts in the University of Florida, and is a neurologist by training and has his JD from the University of Michigan as well. Jeff is a champion for change in the processes for approving devices, trial designs, uses of electronic data and patient-reported data, and ways to interface with payers and track safety long-term. He has built a great team, including innovators from industry, to accelerate the timeline for getting safe. So if you complain to him about the way things are, be careful, he'll recruit you to come help and to help change it. The goal is to get effective devices to patients and professionals, and it's really a breath of fresh air. So if you're in the device business and you aren't able to move things quickly, it is not the FDA's fault, it is your fault. So go ahead, Jeff, we look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Laura, very much. Hello, everyone. I wanted to use my time to talk to you about the future of health tech, innovation and safety from the medical device perspective. And when we talk about innovation, of course, we're talking about far more than simply new or novel technologies. There's also got to be value to patients and consumers. And for FDA, that means the technology is safe and effective, and it addresses an unmet patient need, or it's safer or more effective than currently available alternatives. And so in that respect too, innovation and safety are really two sides of the same coin. And one of the big questions before us is, what will the US environment for health tech be post-COVID-19? And we're certainly going to see clinical care settings increasingly become digital and integrated, and we're going to see clinical care and clinical trials increasingly being done remotely, at home, at work, wherever we can sort of meet the patient and the consumer. And this is going to be through telemedicine and wearables, devices that are interoperable with remote capabilities, clinical decision support, and other health tech. I do think we have an opportunity, though, to learn from this pandemic to facilitate that trajectory, but also to address some of the concerning trends that we're seeing that can disrupt that trajectory, and quite frankly, the future of patient and consumer care. And that's going to require some bold choices on our part, and dare I say, being innovative and risk-taking on the part of government, industry, and the clinical community and others. I mean, today we are seeing more innovative technologies coming to the US first than we did a decade ago. In fact, FDA approved over 100 novel devices in 2020, and that's a big difference from the 28 novel device approvals back in 2010. So that's great, but we are seeing some concerns. So first off, investment in early stage medical devices, particularly startups where a lot of the innovation occurs, has really been drying up over the past few years. We've seen some important players have really left the area, and overall less dollars, maybe some big deals, but really less dollars going into a variety of technologies. And that's for a number of reasons: an opaque, non-homogeneous healthcare system, but also the unpredictability of what it takes for those technologies to get to market, to get coding and reimbursement, and ultimately adopted, in the marketplace. At the same time, we see reimbursement for devices can be an order of magnitude lower than for drugs for the same indication, even if they provide greater value. So if there's a lot of costs up front and unpredictability, that's hard to swallow when your return on investment may be less. The generation of clinical data is becoming increasingly more expensive and time-consuming. And for clinical trials, and particularly for medical devices, you really don't understand the true benefit risk profile of that technology or the performance in the populations who ultimately are going to use that device or have it used on them until you're gathering data in real world settings. And then the regulatory frameworks we have in place were enacted, into law over 4 decades ago. And they're just not fit for purpose for many of the emerging technologies of today and certainly of tomorrow. Essentially, the FDA has been shackled to a square peg that we've got to try to push through a round hole. And ultimately, that puts patients at risk. Nowhere do I see that occurring with greater concern than in the setting of software-based technologies, what in international parlance we call software as a medical device, or SaMD. In fact, for interoperable SaMD, sometimes you need to see modifications being made every few weeks if you're going to continue to assure patient safety and cybersecurity. And then finally, in today's market, China is not just luring US companies to its shores to build manufacturing facilities, it is now investing in and purchasing our innovators and taking that expertise and IP for themselves, and ultimately will move to underprice the marketplace, and we'll see greater dominance of their companies. And quite frankly, if this trajectory continues, within the next decade, China is likely going to be the leader, world leader of health tech, and we will increasingly rely on their imports. Now, we have a chance to change that pathway, and the lessons learned out of COVID can help us get there. Now, there's already been a lot discussed about the technological outgrowths on the pandemic and how that can drive more remote patient care and clinical trials. So instead, I'm going to focus on 2 lessons learned. I think are very important for assuring we continue to have those kinds of technologies and other technological solutions. And those 2 things are regulatory flexibility and engagement. So first, regulatory flexibility, or what's called agile regulation. What it's not about changing the US standard of safety and effectiveness, and is not about cutting corners on the science. But we should be smart about what we need to know and when we need to do it to responsibly introduce new and modified technologies into the marketplace and to get answers quickly and efficiently. It makes no sense in health tech to have a one-size-fits-all regulatory approach. You cannot treat, wound dressings and next-generation sequencing tests and MRI scanners and hip replacements and clinical decision support and heart valves and MRIs all the same way. And we don't quite do that today, but there's a lot of overlap in the things that have to get done, and it doesn't make sense to do that. In fact, today what we deal with is cookie-cutter pathways on a stage gate approach. You got to go through stages, like going down the locks in a canal, and a lot of things where you got to check the box if you're going to go ahead and get across go. And this is sort of chiseled in legislation. But in the setting of the pandemic, when we had a declared public health emergency, we suddenly were given this ability to be flexible through our emergency use authorization authorities, where we could narrowly tailor what it would take for technologies to come to the marketplace. In fact, it allowed us to facilitate the development, validation, authorization, and deployment of medical devices, sometimes really in weeks, rather than what could take months or even longer to occur. And that's why we have authorized over 600 medical devices just for COVID since February. And that's truly remarkable. And so what we need to do is move away from these prescribed pathways and really think about, could we instead have a menu of what we call regulatory building blocks, like regulatory Legos, and that you piece that together based upon the technology. What do you really need to make sure it's safe and effective, and it's risk-based, and you do it in a least burdensome manner? So let me give you an example of what that would look like. Now let's go back to, SaMD. So when the law was created for medical devices, we're talking about 1976. And so we really were discussing your grandmother's technology. I mean, these are simpler hardware devices, and the innovation cycles were a lot slower. And you could take them apart, really understands basic engineering. You could understand what it does, and you could apply that knowledge to similar technologies. I mean, as I was a kid, I would take apart the appliances in our home to learn how they worked. And to the chagrin of my mother, I didn't always put them back the way they should be, and we had to have repairmen in the house, but you really learned a lot. So we are currently test driving different approaches for SAMD in the digital health space. I mean, one of them is, rather than just look at the technology, can we look at the developer? So just like you go to the airport and you could sign up for the TSA pre-check, you know, and if you got a good track record, you're kind of a good person, you go through the line fast. Well, that's the idea with what we call Precert. If you're good on things like software design, clinical evaluation, cybersecurity, then we could leverage that. It in fact answers some questions we otherwise ask on a technology by technology basis when we're reviewing that product come to market. We can answer that for the developer beforehand. We can have really streamlined submissions and pathway to get to the marketplace. You know, we're doing a version of this we're looking at now on AI and particularly machine learning, where if, you know, the developer can put in place good change protocols on the changes they would want to make and how they would validate, then we're looking at moving forward, say, we'll bless the plan, and then you can go ahead and start making these changes in the technology, go through machine learning, update the technology, not necessarily have to come back to the FDA. And then link that up with metrics, key performance indicators, and now also with sort of the post-market leveraging of real-world data in more of a learning system approach. We're even leveraging the data from the technology itself, and we're doing that today in some cases. And so you have a much more continual basis of understanding the capabilities of the developer as well as the performance of the device, and now at real-world use that allows you to go fast. And this can provide incentives and rewards for companies who do well, can provide greater confidence in the safety, effectiveness, and the quality of the product, because information is being put out there in a more regular basis. But it does mean for the FDA that we've got to move and be much more of like a data and analysis hub. It's kind of like a transit control center, you know, where you're looking at the screen and you're seeing all the trains moving. And if things look good, it's a green and you keep going. If there are issues, maybe you got to slow down. It's a yellow, we got to look at some more. And it's a real problem, we can sort of shut that down, and it's a red. That's really a very different approach. Now, we're investing in some of the IT sides and analytics to get there. And we also recently launched our Digital Health Center of Excellence. It's a virtual center with dedicated staff and then experts spread out across the center who come together, sort of drive predictability, consistency in the work we do on digital health, serve as a resource, not only for our folks, but to support other parts of the FDA, build partnerships, and be an innovation hub for some of these different kinds of regulatory paradigms. And this approach that I've mentioned in particular around the developers, we have proposed this in a more modern framework on tests. And we've already been leveraging this in a program we're standing up on device quality that we already piloted with over 60 manufacturing facilities. And we've seen device quality go up and efficiencies in production go down, big cost savings, and better product coming to the marketplace, all from the shift in approach. Lastly, the second lesson learned is engagement. So during the pandemic, we took our approach to working collaboratively with developers of breakthrough devices and essentially put it on steroids so that we could answer questions, provide predictability, problem solve in real time or near real time. I mean, you could be linked up with your reviewer, and certainly earlier in the pandemic, without massive increase in workload, you can get answers informally by phone or email from folks literally within the day, sometimes multiple questions within the day. We had a rolling review still today where submit us the data, don't wait until everything's done. For a while, we had a 24/7 1-800 hotline. We hold at least weekly webinars to provide updates and answer questions, and we do it at least weekly on tests. We've done some other product areas. We've held over 50 of these since the beginning of March. And this level of engagement has been absolutely essential in getting important technologies to patients quickly. Now, we traditionally offer a lot of opportunities to seek advice from our experts, but they tend to be more formal, they can be time delayed, and they're very much focused on the regulatory question posed by the developer. But you know, startups and investors in particular, they need predictability in a business plan that goes beyond regulatory requirements. It's got to touch our experts. Oh, what's that? On efficient evidence generation, you know, patient and provider perspectives, coding, reimbursement, and adoption. So we can really have more technologies and better technologies of patients available more quickly. And that's a big win all around. But to get there, the FDA has got to shift in what we do. It's really talking about, we move the FDA to provide a new kind of total product lifecycle consultancy service. You actually get your FDA consultant who can then tap into the large bench of FDA experts, as well as our connections with the patient communities, the provider communities, and the payer communities. Ultimately help in that developer from design to deployment and beyond. So that's some of what we've learned from COVID. Agile regulation with regulatory Legos, things like Precert, real world data, learning systems, and then the FDA moving to be more of a data analysis hub and providing this total product lifecycle consulting service. So I'll stop there and just maybe open up a few minutes if anyone has any questions.
Jeff, thank you so much. That was a great talk. So maybe I'll start with the first question, which is, you know, when there's the questions that the FDA has, and maybe people are designing for the FDA, but not necessarily for what the payers need to agree to reimburse. And this is, of course, a big pain point for companies. And I've heard you speak to Blue Cross Blue Shield, you know, technology group to talk about this. Perhaps it's time to think about your programs like Precert and start thinking about how we can take this and do evidence generation or coverage with evidence generation and work collaboratively so that you don't get, oh, well, you didn't do it this way and you didn't do it that way, so I'm not going to cover it. And there's this huge waste. Traditionally, the FDA doesn't work with the payers, but what do you think is the right path forward so that we don't have this mismatch and this constant uncertainty about whether things are going to go forward, even if you approve them?
Well, you raise a great point. You got to be working with the payers. And maybe not everyone wants to play, but we are finding increasingly more payers who want to have that conversation and hopefully working together provide that predictability. You know, for medical devices, we already offer an opportunity if there's an interested payer, and this is voluntary. You're a developer, you want to meet with us and the payer to hear about our respective evidence needs, you can go ahead and do that. We facilitate that relationship. In one of our public-private partnerships, we helped set up the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. There's now a new work stream that is focused on this with payers and how we start to provide greater predictability. So I think this can happen. We got to make some smart investments to make it work. But this is where we would go, and we would focus on those payers who, if you will, want to play. You know, dance with the folks who want to dance with you, and let's build it, and I think others will come to the table.
What a great suggestion. I actually think we ought to do this across the FDA for drugs development too. I'll be talking to you about that shortly. So Jeff, thank you so much for a stimulating talk. You did not disappoint. He's innovating faster than you are, so let's try and keep up.